All right. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Speak Up Sal. We have my mentor here today, a new guest, Chris Lewis. Thank you for being on the show
Yeah.
and on the podcast. And we wanted to touch on two previous topics we did a little bit, generational healing and relationship with yourself. So we're going to dive into those a little bit deeper today and talk about our views and how they've affected us in our lives. So
Cool.
yeah, cool.
Yeah.
You want to introduce yourself a little bit and tell everybody who you are and what you do? Cool.
My name's Chris Lewis. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. I'm excited for you and what you're doing here.
Thanks, man.
I work as a tennis pro. I've spent the last 3 to 5 years building a curriculum on wellness, and spent the most of my adult life exploring consciousness and truth and God and love, and it's brought me down a lot of rabbit holes and just trying to find people to explore that with. Sal being one of those people.
That's awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks for taking me along that journey with you. So I appreciate it. All right. So how would you say that generational healing differs from like individual healing? You know, you talked about how you've been focusing on the individual. How have you also focused on the generational? What's the difference?
Sure. So I studied a little bit with Daniel Four. He runs, he used to be out of North Carolina. Now he's moved to Spain. So his premise is that all of our neuroses, all of our issues are basically unhealed generational trauma. And those are both individual. Maybe your dad's was an alcoholic. Maybe your dad's dad experienced abuse, or there's rape, or anything that are specific to the individual family. But then it also goes deeper into the collective. So that would be colonialism, racism, empires. And they aren't separate. Like we draw these distinctions to better understand. We separate things, but they're intertwined. Maybe part of the reason there's drinking and rape and violence is the collective generational issues of racism, of colonialism, of the patriarchy. So we can talk about them separately, but they aren't actually separate. But I think it's important to bring them both into the conversation, and even to start to try to untangle what it is that you're feeling, whether that's guilt and shame. Like is that the guilt and shame of the collective, or is that the guilt and shame of a specific unprocessed event, or is it both?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's good stuff. I really like the point how you brought up that a lot of it continues to happen because those traumas have not been healed. That's kind of what I got out of that in the middle there. So, if we don't focus on these generational healings and do what we need to, make the next generation better, these patterns will continue. Kids will keep having to deal with anxiety, depression, addiction, all these other things, not even because it's their own fault. It's because they inherited it. So that's very interesting.
And I would bring this other point into, pre-empires, especially like pre-1800s, I think they had the context to know that these lives were about healing, were about growth, were about what's ours to do, and to give our kids that better life. And that if we don't heal our stuff, then we give it to our kids as that debt. So just to have the context, just to know that we're here as part of the great transformation at this like really pivotal time when consciousness is shifting from this lower vibrational energy to this higher consciousness, and that's what we're here for. Just to have that context, because you were talking about the kids' anxiety. I think a lot of that is just not having the context to have the meaning and the direction, and we can get more into that when you talk about relationship with self.
Yeah, awesome, man. So this is a big one. This is one I think I personally struggled with for a long time before I even really knew what generational healing was. So what role does forgiveness play in the process of generational healing, and how can someone navigate through these difficult emotions? Forgiveness is a tough one.
Yeah, it's
very hard.
Yeah, so to me, I think recognizing that what we carry, if we hold that, if we are still angry, if we're still resentful, right? We carry that, right? That's something that we're doing to ourselves. So to say that, we forgive, our ancestors for, the rape and the pillaging of land that wasn't theirs, to forgive somebody who's maybe done wrong to our own person, right? It's not saying that's okay. Do you know what I mean? It's not like acknowledging that we allow something like that. On some level, it's the compassion and understanding to know that everybody's doing the best that they can do with what they've been given. So, those people that are harming other people's, they don't have the aperture, they don't have the wherewithal to know that that we're all connected, to know that it's unity. So those people that are harming, those people that are creating that tough environment in the world, right? They're doing that from a place of separation, a place of disconnection. So to see that as a call for compassion, a call for love and for reconnection. And it gets really tricky, right? Because that doesn't mean you want to be around those people. That doesn't mean, so there are sometimes the best thing you can do is to separate yourself from toxic people, whether they be family members or otherwise. But you can still wish them well, carry love for them in your heart from afar.
Yeah, that's good. That's a very important point. I really like how you touched on how you got to forgive them for yourself. You hold that weight on yourself. It causes you a lot of stress. And when reality of it, the other person on the other half of it might not even be thinking about it at all.
Right.
So it's really only just hurting you. So you more so have to forgive them for yourself, not because what you think they did is right or you accept it or you allow it. It's, you think it's wrong, but you have to forgive them so you can let go of that emotional attachment and not carry that weight yourself.
Totally.
Yeah, that's huge.
Well said.
Yeah, you too. So we touched on this a little bit, but would you want to talk about a few more ways of how someone can experience generational trauma in the colonial mindset type of ways? Like what other examples there would be?
Yeah, so a lot of them are patterns of addiction.
Okay.
And I understand, like, a lot of times so they call them the hungry ghosts. Like you have them in Chinese lore and Buddhist lore. So it's basically the cup that can never be filled, the unsatiated. So the person that makes millions and millions, but they feel like they never have enough. The person that has the big house and the big cars, and they're still, so that this idea that, like, we're looking for contentment in the wrong places. So my understanding is a lot of these patterns, especially of addiction, which a lot of times are addictions of power and wealth, which in our culture we actually accept as healthy.
Yeah.
But it could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be shopping, whatever your addiction is. So in a lot of ways, so in the ancient traditions, when your families died, when your family members died, you grieved them, and the grief was the fuel, the energy that carried them into the afterlife, that brought them from this plane to the plane to be with their well ancestors. So that grief, that fuel was the ticket, the passport, right? And since our culture has forgotten how to grieve, or refuses to grieve, or lacks the understanding and context for grief, a lot of our, at least recent ancestors, some longer than others, are basically stuck, disembodied. Their souls are disembodied, stuck on this plane of existence. So they basically fuel themselves through us. They basically it's almost like parasitic. So they're since we are embodied, they are fueling their existence on us now, but in a for most of us, in a non-healthy way.
Yeah.
Because the natural progression or tendency would be for their souls to move into, like, collectively to move towards the collective well ancestors, and then individually to go back into whatever that next chapter of existence is for them. So I think it's really specific to the individual how that shows up for you. But and I know when I was working with one of my lineages, and I was meeting people in the course that were working to heal their lineages, a lot of people were in there to try to help mentally ill relatives that they couldn't quite get to directly. So it's a lot of interesting work. I know a lot of times the black sheeps and the people who have mental illness, or the people, like, a lot of times a lot of the generational trauma can be carried through specific individuals. So, you know, a lot of families have that one child, that one brother, but, you know, if you look at it in that context, that they might be carrying the load, so to speak, for everybody else. You kind of can look at that person with a new capacity. Yeah, it's a broad, deep topic, and one of the best ways, I think, is to just, and this is more accessible for some more than others, but to start to ask questions from living relatives, to start to, Ancestry and Ancestry.com and some of those genetic testing sites, like, can definitely give you some new insights into learning about your people. I know personally, like, I've done a lot of work in indigenous cultures and native peoples, and we tend to have this divide, this this white guilt over, our people, took these lands without asking. They killed the indigenous people that were the stewards of the land. I've traveled a lot of the world, and I haven't been back to a lot of the places that were where my people are from, which is mostly English and Irish. So as I've been doing this work, I now feel this call to go back there, because I'm now looking at my people less like, to just look at us as these colonizers is too small of a context. We're not going back far enough.
Yeah.
But if you start to go back far enough, you see the Celts, and so basically from wherever you're from, they were indigenous at some point, right? Yeah. They were native at some point. And it is important to acknowledge the colonial time period of which we're still living in.
Yeah.
But to continue to broaden the context to see more than just that.
It's awesome. Thank you, man. Thank you for sharing, man. So, sorry, sometimes I need to just take a second. I'll cut it out.
Yeah, good. Do your thing.
All right, so this is one that I wanted to ask you. This comes from personal experience. How can someone navigate potential roadblocks or resistance from family members when introducing the concept of generational healing?
Yeah, it's for some people and it's not for others. And the nice thing is, when you work directly with the well ancestors, so my understanding and my belief is that we all have guides, angels, people on the other side, higher dimensional beings that want to work with us and for humanity. So, but we have free will here, so they can't intervene without us asking. So the beautiful thing is, when you bring in your well ancestors, when you bring in these guides, they're doing the work in these causal planes, in these energetic fields that are healing the field. So it's harder to work with the living. We're a little bit more stuck, a little bit more rigid in our ways of being and acting. So sometimes it's easier to go right to the source. So I would say, you don't push it, right?
Yeah.
What comes up for me is there's one of the tools of the ancient world was this tree diagram that went out of the Egyptian temple at Waset, And it basically says you have root people, you have trunk people, you have branch and limb people, you have leaf people. So if you're that root person, you're holding the existing structures. You don't want to move, right? The trunk people are working for those structures. They ground stuff, but they don't want to think in new ways. They don't want to pioneer. Like, so the fact that we're here doing this talk probably means we're more leaf people.
Yeah.
We're more flexible. We're out on the limbs blowing and moving. And that flexibility is what allows us to think in new ways, to pioneer new concepts. So don't go to a trunk person and say, hey, I need you to abandon the structures that you do. So I think it's great to introduce these things to family members, and you'll see pretty quickly whether they're and you know, the proof's in the pudding. If they start to see you blossoming and flowering and living abundantly, maybe they say, hey, let's try this. But maybe they don't. You know, some people are pretty clingy and stuck to their modes, even to their trauma, even to their sorrow. And they're saying, like, be careful how much pain you try to take from someone. Like, people need their pain, and people need to process and move through their pain at their own rate. So, and that's where, like, you're an intuitive guy, you know.
Thank you.
So I would feel it out, see, you know, throw out those breadcrumbs slowly and kind of see how they. I also find when you start to, it's the legacy, it's why they're all here. So, you know, typically I can't get a lot of traction from my parents on a lot of the realms I work in, but when I start to talk about ancestral stuff, and I start to talk about, you know, our lineage came, like, you can see where the names switched over from this to that in the 1500s and 1600s. And I recognize that is the white privilege to be able to go back and see those things, where a lot of, you know, colored and indigenous will have a much harder time tracking their records back. But circling back, I do see more traction with my parents when I start to get into those realms, because it's about them, right?
Yeah.
They are, like, that is where they came from, and that is their history. That is so. So sometimes it can be a common ground, a meeting point for the old and the new.
Yeah. And I think what you said about blossoming and doing well is really interesting, because what your parents and some other people's parents might not agree on, when you raise your kids and they're doing well and you see those kids blossom, they're going to be like, oh, okay, you know, if you're doing well, you know what you're talking about. And I hope to be able to do the same, just like you have one day here soon. So
yeah, totally. I guess the other tricky piece would be people have different definitions of blossoming. Right?
Yeah, that's true too.
They say, hey, our kids are happy and healthy, and you say, yeah, but they're not
their 401k.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, I get that.
So it's tricky.
Yeah, definitely a tough one. I like how the stages of the tree is 4 stages, and a lot of the stages you talk about are in 4s, like the stages of self. I feel like a lot of those could relate to the tree. The static would be like more of a root person or a trunk person.
Totally.
And as you go down through it.
Yeah. And you see lots of 4s and lots of 7s. So the 7-fold order, you know, you see that in the Bible. So, and that's also would be the stages that an idea progresses into being. And it would also be the stages of maturity for a lot of people. They call it the 4-fold cybernetic order, which is basically input, process, output, feedback, which is like kind of how the thermostats work. But that's a good point. You do see a lot of the ancient tools working in 4s and 7s. Yeah. But if you look at what the human mind is capable of processing, the conscious mind at least, it's usually 7 plus or minus 1 or 2. So, like, you can't, like, if you put various objects on a table and then took them all off and said, how many can you name? Most people would be somewhere between 6 and 8. So part of that 4 and 7, I think, are just accessible ways of working with things.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of reading on how they have that in Buddhism too. They have the 4-fold, and they have the 8, I believe.
Is it 8 noble
truths? Yep, that's it.
Eight
So yeah, I was hoping to do an episode on that in the future once I learn a little more. So that'd be a cool one. Yeah. Cool. So would you like to dive into, like, change it up a little bit, go into relationship with self?
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you want to open up with talking about the 4 stages of self, something that you personally taught me?
Yeah.
Static, linear, spherical, and holographic.
Yeah.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, so I've been building these classes and beta testing them. So I was doing a class on relationships, and I started seeing these different ways that people relate. And then I started seeing that it goes past relationships more into ways of being. So we ended up with these 4 stages, basically, static, linear, spherical, and holographic. So the static stage is basically geared towards trauma and addiction. So when we have trauma that we haven't processed, we're basically looking through the lens of that trauma. So usually that leads to some sort of fear where so basically what's primary is that root chakra. It's that sense of security and safety in the world. And if you don't feel this deep sense of safety, and also with that, I would say, like, community, like that connection, right? If you don't feel a sense of community, a sense of connection, a sense of safety, you're gonna cling to the known. You're looking for comfort. You're looking for survival. And then slightly up from that would be this linear way of thinking, which is more of with the systems, the political system, the education system, that are mostly geared towards competition. So it's us versus them. It's a war model. Man versus nature, man versus each other. So basically it's the right versus the left. So we do a lot of clinging to what we think is right and true, and then attacking and defending that. So we try to get our little tribe that thinks like we think. And then if somebody doesn't think like we think that they're the enemy, or they're what's wrong with the world. And the levels are a good tool. We have the 4 levels of being, which are show that the whole, God, whatever you want to call that whole of existence unfolds into complementary principles, which unfolds into patterns, which unfolds into the everyday. So you start to see beyond that duality of either or. And when you start to look at complementary processes and principles, light and dark, hot and cold, right? If you get rid of the positive end of the circuit, you don't have a working circuit anymore. So when you start to see the wider context in how this reality as actually functioning, it stops being so much us versus them and right versus wrong. But that second level, that linear level, is very much rooted in the us versus them. When you start to have the context that you're on the path, when you start to ask questions, when you start to become curious, when you start to give up the external authority and you start to look at your internal authority, the resonance, the vibration, what feels, it's really moving from head to heart, right? From what you've been told to what you feel is true. That's when you start to become more embodied, and that's what we're calling spherical. So spherical would, in the maturation process, would start to be moving from an adolescence to an adult. And then the spherical to the holographic would start to be moving from the adult to the elder. So the elder has the context and the understanding to hold everybody's viewpoint as valid. It has a place, it's very accepting, and we can model that way of being to guide our young people in the world. So one of the big movements from 3rd stage spherical to 4th stage holographic is in spherical, you're starting to be embodied, but you stop being, you see past that lens of separateness, right? When you're in stage 4 holographic, time and space stop being a separation, they stop being a limitation. So you move into unity consciousness. So even though we have these two separate bodies, right? We have these porous fields that are interacting. So what I'm feeling in here is part of what you're feeling there, right? They're these merging fields. Basically the movement, and this is part of the transformation, the movement from lower consciousness to higher consciousness is the movement from separation to unity. And the more, if we're concerned with the external authority, if we're concerned with what other people think, we're constantly giving our energy out. We're constantly sending our energy out to see what they think. What do they think of us? But a lot of times we lose contact with what's actually going on in here. So to have that, to be in conversation, to feel how we're interacting with our environment, we have to be mostly and at least partially like internally focused. And what's coming into our field will naturally come into our field instead of being so outwardly pushing.
Okay, so I like how you talked about how we have to focus inward. When I was doing a lot of the artwork and stuff for you, I saw the holographic stage as like a very high level of consciousness, knowing, and awareness, and not just external, like you were saying. A lot of internal stuff has to be done as well to be able to reach that stage. Do you think that that's a stage that a lot of people get to in life before, you know, their time is over?
I think it's going to become more and more acceptable as we're making this shift into, the great transformation is picking up. So now I also know that in these times of the indigenous people have prophecies of the two earths. Some people call it the harvest. So my understanding is some people will not make the shift. Some people do not want to transform. Some people do not want to leave the old ways of being.
Root people.
The root people, yep. Yeah, totally. And the trunk people probably as well. But I see like, I see it more and more as a generational thing. Like I'm 37, you're 23, right? I see that your generation is less willing to trade time for money, like my parents' generation, who are children of whose parents were in, lived through the Depression or the World Wars. So, I think that, and that's where we get into that generational trauma. I think people that lived through the Depression, through the World Wars, they have this scarcity, this sense that like there's not enough, and we better make sure we have enough. Yeah. And then that influences their children. Where I think we've moved far enough away from that, or at least the time has come where your generation says, I'm not willing to do that. But for some of the ones I know, that they haven't quite found, they're like, I know I'm not going to do this. I know I'm not just going to work my ass off to survive. But some of them don't have the context to know what they're meant to do, what their unique purpose is.
Where to go next.
Yeah. They're like, I know this isn't for me, but I don't know what is. Yeah. So, and that's a lot of the intention of what I'm trying to do, is to give the context and the tools to allow your generation to go out there and say, this is for me, and that's for me, and that's for me. Kind of as these individual notes in this greater symphony or orchestra, as a team that's going to carry us into that great transformation.
It's awesome.
I would like to say something about relationship with self and the different generations.
Yeah.
So like, I got my first cell phone at 16, and it could like punch number, it could text, and you got like 150 characters. And that was like a big deal because I was going to play a tennis tournament in Arizona. And my parents were like, we want you to have this. Right. But when did you get a phone? Like,
I was probably 12.
12. All right. So, and that phone could probably do amazing things.
Slid open, had a little keyboard.
But now I see 3-year-olds on tablets on like, so I guess and people are always like, is the phone good? Is the phone bad? Like, one, staying out of good and bad, because they're mostly judgments based on whether, meaning you like or don't like. So if I'm always trying to look at the process and look at the field interactions that underlie the form. So you wouldn't give your 12-year-old, maybe you wouldn't give your 7-year-old a chainsaw and say, go have fun. Yeah. Right? It's too powerful of a tool for a child that young. So I think collectively we've underestimated the power of the phone and haven't set enough regulatory boundaries around it. So there are our vertebrae and our nervous system. There's this central channel that basically runs from the heavens to the center of the earth. And that is basically our grounding rod. It's how we connect this like higher celestial energy and we ground it here in the world of form. When you get on that phone, that is a portal into the infinite, right? You have access to crazy amounts of people information. So I see this like portal that basically goes out kind of like this, right? But part of that portal that goes out is also pulling us. So what was running up and down, what was grounding heaven and earth and keeping us here in our bodies is now pulling us out into the infinite, which is fine if we then know how to come back into our bodies.
Yeah.
It's fine if we can minimize or regulate the time we spend on it. But when we start to spend too much time on it without setting boundaries, it starts to consume us. So we start to lose this sense of our bodies, this sense of self, this higher connection. So the phone is this incredibly powerful tool. But when we don't have context to understand who we are and why we're here, it's instead of being a tool, it starts to become a substitute for self. So like when we're kids, we're trying on all these masks. We're trying to figure out who we are. We're like, I'm this, I'm that. And most of that's, when I was growing up, was from direct experience. I interacted with that kid. I went to that party. I had this sports event. I went to school, right? But now we're starting to see the construction of self, how you construct how other people see you through the lens of the phone. So you're saying, this is my profile. This is what I share. And we get to be more selective in how we contrive that. So we're not going to show the fuck ups. We're not going to show like so then everybody has this distorted view of their self, and ego not as a bad thing, ego just as the construction of self. Yeah. So then everybody feels a little bit inauthentic in the sense that this isn't really me. And then when they don't live up to that, there's this cognitive dissonance, this friction. And then they see everybody else that looks like beautiful and merry because they're only showing the best stuff.
Yeah.
So just in terms of how we relate with the world, how we construct the self, like it's changed. It's
a very different time. And especially with the phones, that you said you went out and had these experiences. I went out a lot and had those experiences, but you know, my kids coming, they might just have experiences through the phone. Like everything they learn could be through that. That's how big of a tool it is. Yeah. And I feel like that would really have a disconnect between our relationship with self. Yeah.
So if we go back to so we have these primary tools that I find we keep returning to. So in these 6 intelligences, you have the physical and the emotional, which are your direct experiences. They're your everyday. You have the analytical and synthesizing, which are your mental intelligence. It's how you focus on information and how you integrate it into higher meaning. And then you have the imaginal and the intuitive. So information, right, how you think about something is primarily that mental, analytical, and synthesizing. But if you don't go out and ground those in direct experiences, if you don't go out, so if I'm constantly typing if my interactions are all typing on a screen, right, the physical and the emotional doesn't have all that much to work with. Where if I'm going out and meeting people at a party or at a bookstore or a coffee shop, like the face-to-face has more for the physical and emotional to work with.
Yeah.
So it's tricky, and we're navigating uncharted territory.
Yeah.
But I think we can all see that from the rates of anxiety and depression, especially in younger generations, that something needs to change. And I think it's the context. I think it's the way we view the phone and interact with it. So I'm watching I've been listening to The Lord of the Rings on audiobook with my 5-year-old. And I do think, like, now I'm not saying the phone is evil, like like the ring, but it does have this, like, it has its own sovereignty, its own will, where when you put that ring on, even if you have good intentions, right, it starts to change the way you think. It starts to change the way you interact. So, so we want to create these boundary lines between who we are, how we feel, and the phone itself. So this really good understanding of self, so that we're using the phone as the tool instead of the phone being the self. If you're developing your sense of self from what people say about you on Facebook and your Facebook account, your Instagram account, like, that is supremely unhealthy.
Yeah. You're gonna have a very bad image of yourself.
Yeah, and even like part of the classes I'm teaching are a movement from external authority to internal authority. So for my parents' generation, the external authority was the systems. It was the church. It's the education system. It's the political system. For the kids' generation, the external authority is the masses, their friends, peer, Facebook, social media.
Yeah, any like influencer, stuff like that.
Yeah. So, and when we develop our sense of self from the external authority, that makes us so fragile. We're like, you know, if who I am is dependent on what you say about me, God forbid if you say something bad about me, I'm gonna fucking crumble, man. Where if I know who I am, if I'm like, I have this really strong sense of self, I can recognize that someone's harsh words about me are speaking more to them than they're speaking to about me. I'm like, oh, that's not me.
Yeah.
Right. So, and how do we get that strong internal authority? That's shifting the lens to be more contemplative, to be more focused inward than outward. And that takes time. That's part of the maturation process.
Yeah. So we're at 40. Do you want to call it? Be done for the day?
Whatever you feel, man. If you got any more questions.
No questions really. Just want to, thank you again for all you do, setting this up and making this possible, and also teaching me a lot of what I know on this. So, hey, thank you.
Yeah, man.
It's been real.
I'm excited for your path, and
thank you, man.
And to see you come into fatherhood and all the new chapters that await you.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, dude.
So, until next time, thanks for tuning in, guys. See you.